All right. I'm going to start all over. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Jody Rose. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. On behalf of our partners, Interfaith Power and Light, thank you for taking the time to log onto our 2023 legislative debrief for Maryland faith communities. This is a bookend to our legislative briefing back in January. To begin, we have asked Reverend Margaret Brack to deliver an opening prayer and land acknowledgement. She is the rector at St. Albans Episcopal Church over in Salisbury and also the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church over there. She serves on the Maryland Episcopal Public Policy Network and feels her ministry calls her to care for the environment and stand up for the rights of all people. So thank you, Reverend Brack, for kicking us off.
Okay, thank you. Let us join. Creator God, open our hearts today as we gather to review the legislation and bills that we have been striving to have passed or transformed. We pray for strength as we seek justice, protection, and means of rebirth for the land. May we continue to educate and push for and use the gifts you have given us, solar, wind, and water. May we seek in our quest for legislation that will aid and provide comprehensive improvement to laws, our towns and our cities, and for the environment that is in dire straits and should have our full attention because it is our home earth. Help us to acknowledge change needed, give us clear minds and hearts to decipher the truth behind the ignorance and intentional turning away of some. We pray that we may look at every circumstance through your lens, God, a lens of truth, love, grace, and mercy. In thanksgiving for all those who continue this tireless pursuit for justice for our Mother Earth and as a whole, and the people who dwell here. Amen. And our land acknowledgement today, we wish to hold space for reflection on and gratitude for the land upon which we live and the local waters that support and nourish us all. We recognize that this land and these waters were stewarded by many who came before. For tens of thousands of years, Algonquin-speaking cousins called the shores of the Chesapeake home. Although we have lost many names, we ask you to honor them for their stewardship of these ancient lands and waters. Our hearts are full of hope as we come together with honor for all life. And now over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Reverend Brack, and welcome everybody. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Rear, the Director of Climate Policy and Justice at the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and I also serve as a board member at Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. So this year, the last week of the Maryland legislative session coincided with Passover. So as I found myself reflecting on one of the questions we ask ourselves during the traditional Passover Seder, why is this night different from all other nights? I found myself pondering the question, why was this legislative session different from all other legislative sessions? It was, and there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. So here's a few. It was the first term of a brand new administration. The inauguration even happened after the start of the legislative session. So there were definitely some learning curves and maybe training wheels to go on and off. About a quarter of all legislators were new, and 1/3 of the committee leadership were new in those roles. And that included a whole new committee in the Senate that heard all the energy and environmental bills. And in addition to environmental and climate issues, the legislature was grappling with some really big and divisive topics like cannabis, reproductive rights, trans health, and gun violence. So today we're going to hone in on those environmental and climate issues. I will reflect on the bills that passed and those that didn't, and what that means for all of us. But first off, it's a time to say thanks. It's a time to say thank you for showing up today, right? As we debrief, but from the start of session, you were there. People of faith were there in Annapolis, in your homes, making calls, in your congregation, in your congregations, writing to your elected officials. As I like to remind people, you did hire them, so they work for you, and you can ask them to do things. So make sure your voice is really, really important, and it's because you showed up. It's because you're using your voice, you're answering the call, that these bills passed. Period. The end. You did it. So thank you and congratulations. Because from a sort of headliner perspective, you had a pretty good session if you care about clean air, clean water, and healthy communities, as I imagine all of those joining this call do. And so you'll hear more about some of these, but the wins included offshore wind, community solar, forest conservation, Greenspace Equity, Maryland the Beautiful, the Clean Trucks Act of 2023, sustainable buildings, as well as buying more sustainable concrete as a building material. There was also a bill to establish energy storage targets, which is a critical piece for clean energy. And it wasn't just legislation, but Governor Moore also set a goal for the state to produce 100% clean energy by 2035 and announced that his administration would be implementing the Clean Cars 2 regulation. And many of the wins this session were in service to implementation of a big bill that we passed last year, the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. It's not enough just to pass a bill that makes us a leader in the nation in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We have to do the work to implement that bill. So that's what some of the bills this year did. And finally, in the win category, I do want to emphasize that as part of the Climate Solutions Now Act, the state defined for the first time overburdened and underserved communities, which helps direct funding and other resources where they're needed the most. And we saw that language show up across several pieces of legislation this session. The whole idea was that a lack of definition could no longer serve as an excuse for inaction on environmental justice. And we saw that happen in real time. So those were the highlights. The losses did really sting. There were several significant losses. You'll hear more about Empower and energy efficiency in just a bit. But I also really want to mention the Climate, Labor, and Environmental Equity Act, which did not pass. It did pass out of one committee this year, but it didn't go further than that. And that would have focused on cumulative impacts, the cumulative impacts of environmental pollution and the socioeconomic and health status of a community where proposed projects would be cited. So that was also something that didn't get through this year. So, but with that, I'm going to hand it back over and look forward to hopping back on in a bit to talk about some specific bills.
All right, unmuted. Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for those insights. And if Molly could share some slides. Jewish communities are in the time of counting the 7 weeks of Omer. Last night, Jewish communities counted 15 days, which is 2 weeks and 1 day of the Omer so far. Ramadan is also coming to a close right now, another counting of days of fasting. So counting can be a meaningful spiritual practice. So by the numbers, how did people of faith show up this session? All right, do we have slides? Getting there. Great, thank you, Molly. Over 200 people joined the January legislative session, the beginning of this process that we're closing up today, representing 105 congregations. Between IPC and IPL, we were sending out emails engaging folks in the legislative session to over 7,000 Marylanders. 350 people signed IPC's petition and supported the Maryland Beautiful Act. Folks in faith communities sent 146 messages to their legislators through IPL's platform. Maryland faith communities posed with IPL's photo petition, the For All That Has Breath, Strengthen, Empower campaign, producing dozens of beautiful photos. Faith organizations advocated for Empower legislation as part of their lobby days in Annapolis, Maryland Catholics for Common Home Lobby Day, Episcopal Advocacy Day, United Methodist Lobby Day, and the AIM, PATH, and ACT Lobby Day. And in a critical moment after the Empower legislation passed the House, we heard the bill might not be heard in Senate. And half a dozen faith leaders made calls during Holy Week and Passover to Senate President Ferguson and Committee Chair Ryan Feldman and got the bill moving again. So some really great recaps of numbers. Next slide. And then this slide just shows all of the various faith groups that endorsed a bill one way or another. So just really showing the power of this youth movement. And we can go ahead and stop the slides, Molly. So we have a lot to celebrate. And to add to that celebration, we'd like to thank Delegate Dana Stein for all of his leadership. And he's joined us here today. We're very honored. Delegate Stein is the vice chair of the House Environment and Transportation Committee. He represents District 11 in Baltimore County and has been a rock star champion for environmental causes for many years. So thank you, Delegate Stein, for all that you do to fight for us in office and for being here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And just like it's a pleasure to be working with you during legislative session, so many sessions when the faith community has been present and heard and had a big impact. And I can speak from the vantage point of the Environment and Transportation Committee because that's the committee I serve on. But I know that, through other committees in the House and the Senate, you also have a big impact. And, I know last year, the faith community played a very active role in the passage of Climate Solutions Now. And that was a legislation I was very involved with in the House. And as you know, that was the most ambitious climate law that any state has passed. And Rebecca referenced how a number of provisions are being implemented or studies are going to come out of it. So not only did the bill put in place a number of new measures, but it sort of laid the groundwork for future action, which will be important to implement. And I look forward to working with the faith community and making sure those future actions get implemented. This year, the testimony from Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake and other religious groups were helpful in particular. Again, this is from my vantage point on the E&T committee in passing the Greenspace Equity Bill, Maryland the Beautiful, and the Forest Conservation Act. There's a reason why religious and secular people alike refer to the world as God's green earth. And, I know that everyone agrees with the sense that we have to protect the earth for future generations, not just for our well-being, but especially for those who come after us. And I really, looking back at the testimony that faith groups, in particular, Interfaith Partners provided, I really, in particular, love the testimony that Jody provided on the Forest Conservation Act. She said, forests are creation's cure-all, meaning they restore balance to the earth in terms of cleaner water, cleaner air to breathe, flourishing ecosystems, home and habitat for birds and insects, holding the soil from erosion, a place to play, a place to pray. This is a gift entrusted to our care, and it is our responsibility to ensure we are preserving forests, not only for today, but also for tomorrow. And so to me, that was particularly moving, that was particularly compelling. And it is just but one example of the testimony that Interfaith Partners and many religious groups and organizations provided, especially in these three bills. But I know you were also active in the Empower Act, which unfortunately didn't make it across the finish line, but next year. And I know with your support, we'll be successful next year on that. And I guess I like to close with two comments. First was yesterday, as celebration of Earth Day, I visited a project in Baltimore that's converting a vacant lot into community green space on East North Avenue. And the community leader, there were a number of volunteers, not nonprofit employees who were there. And the community leader of the Broadway East Association was there. And she talked about all the benefits of green space in a way that, while it wasn't necessarily spiritual, it conveyed so many profound impacts, both to, to individuals, from their quality of life to kids being, when they're walking to school, being able to walk across a green space as opposed to a vacant lot that's got debris and trash and broken glass, to the aesthetics, since this lot is right on North Avenue, to the visual impact that it has as people come in to drive through or walk through her community. So it's something that her remarks were very powerful and made me realize that this is, such a concrete example of the impact of the work that you all do in working for more green space, for forest conservation, for protecting the earth. And so thank you very much for all your work. And then my second closing comment is it's just a request, and I imagine you're probably in your congregations doing this already, but please be sure to let everyone know about the benefits, especially under federal legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, that families, especially low to moderate income families, can take advantage of for electrifying, say, their HVAC systems, their water heaters, for additional incentives for insulation. I read a lot in the paper about the EV related incentives from that act, and while those are important, there are so many household benefits, and I think we all need to spread the word about those, so as many Marylanders as possible take advantage of that. So with that, I'll close, and again, just thank you so much. It is a pleasure working with you. With so many good-hearted people, and with people who have an impact on legislation. So many thanks for your efforts this session, previous sessions, and the sessions to come.
Thank you, Delegate Stein, and thanks for being here. I hope you're getting a little bit more sleep these days. But it just really means a lot to us, and it really means a lot to hear what it's like on your side to have us standing there beside you. We really need to just kind of reaffirm that. And so I just want to reinforce with everybody on this call, thank you for showing up, for being there. This was a really great year. There are years that are very challenging. So let's just kind of pack this one in. This was also really challenging, but we have so many great wins out of this. So pack this in your feelings, right? Like this is that feeling when you play golf with a hole in one, and then the next 50 or maybe not what you want. So really just pack this into your brain for future motivation. So thank you, Delegate Stein, for being here. We know you may have to hop off, and feel free to do that. So great. So now we are going to dive into the bills one by one, and everybody has about 3 to 4 minutes to talk about a bill, and then have time for 1 or 2 questions. And so, the speakers will call for that, when they're done. And does anybody have any questions? And feel free to unmute yourself, or, if you want to raise your hand. And then after 1 or 2, we'll move on. Okay. So first up is Reed Perry. If we could spotlight Reed.
Great. Thanks so much, Jody. And my name is Reed Perry, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for Chesapeake Conservancy, which is a Chesapeake Bay watershed conservation nonprofit. And I'm going to talk to you briefly about 2 bills that were passed this session. The first, the Greenspace Equity Program, and then the second, the Maryland the Beautiful Act. And both were sponsored by Delegate Stein. So I want to first thank Delegate Stein for his leadership, just outstanding member to work with, and he did a fantastic job in crafting these bills and advancing them. And so we're very lucky to have his leadership on House E&T and in the General Assembly. So the first bill is the Greenspace Equity Program. And before I get into the what happened, so what, and now what, I just want to give very brief background on this idea. And so Maryland, when it comes to land conservation, protecting parks and forests, we're actually we do a really good job, and we've invested a lot of resources in conservation over the past 50 or 60 years. And the reason why we've done so well is that we have dedicated revenue that goes into conservation each year. We have some great programs like Program Open Space and the Rural Legacy Program. And so to date, we've conserved a lot of land, and we've protected significant habitat, but that has not happened equitably. And if you look at how Maryland has developed over time. If you look at our big urban landscapes and municipalities, there's a clear lack of green space in many communities. And we've come to realize that that has really significant negative impacts on public health, on local economies, on just generally elements of community well-being. And so the conservation community in the past handful of years has really taken kind of definitive steps to try to figure out how can we resolve this. And so the idea for a new program was born, something called the Greenspace Equity Program. So what happened is Delegate Dana Stein and Senator Jim Rosapep, they introduced legislation this year. This was reintroduced last year. There was an initiative, part of a bigger package that called the Maryland Beautiful Act, which we'll talk about. So they reintroduced and revised the legislation, and you know, through the legislative process, we had really outstanding testimony from lots of community partners, from environmental groups, from neighborhood associations, and from the faith community, from Interfaith Partners. So we were successful. We got the legislation passed, and what this legislation does is it creates a new grant program for the state of Maryland to fund green space projects in Maryland's underserved and overburdened communities. So Rebecca talked about the climate bill that was passed last year and the definitions that were included in that bill. So we took those definitions, and that's how we're targeting these new green space projects to make sure that we're helping to fill the gap and bring green space to communities that currently lack it. So it's going to be a grant program that supports land acquisition, so buying and protecting spaces to make them into green space. And it's also going to fund the improvement of existing green spaces. So capital projects that will help to improve green space for better public use. The funding that will be appropriated, $5 million in the first year, $7 million in the second year, and then $10 million in the third year and subsequent years. And that funding is going to support, again, creating new parks, new trails or trail connections, community gardens, and other green spaces. This is funding that it's going to be in the budget. We have dedicated revenue going for it, so that's great. So in terms of next step, of course, we need to have it signed by the governor, and we're of course really confident that that will happen. And then the Department of Natural Resources will work to implement the legislation and start to kind of form bounds around what the program looks like, how it will operate, and we'll have the first year of funding go out in FY25. I think I'll jump to the next bill, and then we'll take questions after that. So the next piece of legislation that was passed is called the Maryland the Beautiful Act. And this was, again, reintroduced last year. We didn't get it across the finish line, so it was reintroduced and led by Delegate Dana Stein and Senator Sarah Elfreth. This is a land conservation package, so it includes a couple of different provisions. The basic background about 30 by 30 is that, you know, in addition to the climate crisis, we also have this global biodiversity crisis. So we're losing biodiversity and species abundance at a rate only seen before during mass extinction periods. Something like 100 species per day. So we have like 8 million species on Earth roughly, and we're losing thousands and thousands of each year. And so globally, there's within the conservation community, there's now a movement to protect up to 30% of land and water for nature by 2030. And so we have this global movement, and that is now trickling down on the national level. So many nations are taking on 30 by 30 goals. The United States has a goal through a Biden executive order that was issued as a part of his climate package. And so other states are taking this on. So Maryland has now joined a number of states in passing a 30 by 30 goal. And this is a 30% by 2030 land conservation goal. But we didn't just want to set a goal for land conservation. We also wanted to create some funding and some programs to help implement this goal. And when we talk about land conservation in Maryland, one of the biggest actors or engines in conservation are local land trusts. So local land trusts basically buy and protect land and monitor it and steward it in perpetuity. And so across Maryland, there are local land trusts in every region, in every county that help to buy and protect land. They work with local governments, they work with the state of Maryland. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were supporting land trusts that we know can help us to achieve this goal. So in addition to the 30 by 30 and 40 by 40 goals that are set by this legislation, we also created a revolving loan fund, which is a new source of capital that land trusts can tap into for land acquisition projects, which is really important. The real estate market is highly competitive right now, and land trusts are having a hard time acting quickly enough to buy and protect land, even if they have a willing landowner that says, hey, I really want to protect my farmland or my forest land in perpetuity. And so that this new fund is really going to help to support land trusts. It also authorizes new grant funding for land trusts to help with stewardship and capacity building. So kind of training land trust staff, training volunteers. And then it also supports a new 40 by 40 implementation grant program that, again, is going to support land trusts through kind of trainings and conferences. So that's really the gist of the program. The legislation, again, it'll need to be signed into law by the governor, and then the Department of Natural Resources will work to implement the legislation. I do want to note that this bill would be funded through general funds. And so going forward, we're definitely going to need to advocate for funding in future budget years to make sure that we can get funding for the revolving loan fund and for these grant programs. So that's the gist of the Maryland the Beautiful Act. Again, this is about protecting a bigger share of Maryland's natural areas and habitat areas, so that as we grow and develop, we'll continue to have space for people and nature. So with that, I'm happy to take a question or two if there's time.
Yes, there's time if anybody has any questions. Thanks, Reed. That was very thorough. Let people unmute themselves. And it's okay if there's no questions, but okay, great. And if you think of something, pop it in the chat box. Reed will be here, or if he has to step out, we'll make sure we get the question to him. Great. So next up is Joelle. Thank you, Reed.
And spotlight Reed. Oh, there we go. Okay. It's really great to hear about some of the victories from the bills that we heard about back when we gathered for the legislative briefing call. Our priority bill from Interfaith Power and Light was not one of them. So, but I first want to say I am so proud of the way our faith communities mobilized to speak out together for strengthening the Empower program. This bill would have aligned Maryland's energy efficiency program with our climate goals and taken full advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and supported all of us as Maryland residents in shifting away from gas burning appliances and towards electrification. And I'm particularly proud of the way you saw many of these pictures in the slideshow at the beginning, the way we really framed our call for strengthening Empower in spiritual, moral, and positive terms. We're not anti-gas, we are pro-breathing. And that movement that we built of folks of every different faith tradition who raised their voices together for getting away from burning fossil fuels, getting away from the harms that burning gas continues to do to all of us. that movement, exists, and we built it, and it's still here, and we'll carry on to fight for full electrification. But I've invited our colleague Len here to talk about what happened to the bill itself. So the bill passed the House in fairly good shape. We were feeling okay. It came before the Senate committee on the last day of session, but we'd heard from several senators who had checked in with us that we were on track. And then the committee killed the bill on the afternoon of the last day of session. It was a real gut punch for me personally, just partly because it was so unexpected. And I'm still trying to understand for myself what we think happened and what we can learn from that. So, Len.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for being such a great support system while we were engaged in the efforts in Annapolis. Having your backup was indispensable. We were disappointed that the bill did not make it across the finish line in the end. A lot of good was done on it. It was a very complex bill, and the bill that came out of the House was actually 3 bills combined into one, which made it even more complex. And there were some additional consumer provisions put in there that made it an even better bill. But we were working against the clock. The bill came from the House to the Senate after what's called the crossover day, which means that's the rule when all bills to come out of one house and go across. It can still move even if it misses that deadline, but it's just one more hurdle to jump. Once the bill came out of the House, it was came out in a form that the utilities liked less than they did before. So they were out in the background. There are lobbyists, many lobbyists saying, this is a very complex bill. I'm not really sure. It's very confusing. And they were going through all the reasons why people should not jump on moving it right away. And the other issue we had was there were initially 2 bills submitted in each house. One was advocates, and the other one was from the Public Service Commission, but it was from the Public Service Commission run by commissioners appointed by former Governor Hogan. And Governor Moore had nominated people to take their place. They had not yet taken office, and a lot of the folks were saying, especially in the Senate, well, why don't you work with the new commissioners to come up with a product you could work on together rather than having to work with a proposal submitted by commissioners appointed by Governor Hogan. And we said, well, we could do that in the long run, but we think that there's some things that need to be done now. The other issue is the House bill, which was a very good product. The reason why it came together after the crossover deadline is the committee had a lot of really other major legislation to work on, primarily the cannabis bill, which was really all encompassing to the House Economic Matters Committee. And so it was a matter of capacity. And I'm giving you all these reasons, not because I think that they were good excuses, but because they were the excuses that were used when we spoke to people. And so I do want to say, so anyways, so it was House committee was working on the legislation. They got to it a little bit later, and they were doing it in some small work groups. And so when it finally came out, 4 of the different cabinet departments said, well, we have some changes to the bill. And there were really technical changes, nothing that anybody objected to, but it caused the people in the Senate to say, these are having problems with the bill. How are we going to deal with this with just a few days left to go? So it became, another reason. But I do want to say that, in all my time in observing the actions of the House of Delegates that and the House Economic Matters Committee, that Delegate Brian Crosby, who's not, in addition to being the vice chair of the Economic Matters Committee, is also the chair of the Utilities Subcommittee, was really the first person I've seen in that committee in a long time to stand up to the utilities and say, I know what you're saying, but I don't buy what you're saying, and what we're doing is the right thing to do. And he had the guts to stand up to them. And I think he really is owed our thanks for being a very, very good leader, a courageous leader, and a very skilled leader in terms of getting the legislation put together. There was a picture of the advocates sitting at the Senate committee meeting on the last day of the session when the committee members were saying that they were not able to deal with this legislation this session. And we all had these really twisted looks on our faces. And especially me, I had this really sour expression. And there it was in Maryland Matters the next day, my sour expression from being in there. But it was clear, we really thought that when the bill came out of the Rules Committee and was being sent to the House Triple-Committee, and that they are having a hearing on it, and then they're going to have a voted session on it, we really thought that they're going to do it, and that's why we were surprised that it didn't happen. When we were in the room, one Democratic senator after another just pretty much said the same thing. This is a very complex bill. I don't really understand what it does. We don't have time to work on it. Does it really have to be done this year? And when each of them in succession said the same thing, it was pretty clear that the fix was in. I saw the comment, the delegate to thank is Delegate Brian Crosby, a leader in this. He was responsible for getting the bill out of the House committee. He was the one who worked all the details to get 3 bills combined into one bill. And I do think he's owed our thanks, and I think he really made move the ball down the field so that next year we don't have to start from scratch, because he has a product that we could work off of. So since that many legislators have not experienced, and that is now for the first time in 9 years, we have a governor who has an unabashedly pro environment commitment. And so I think working not just with the Public Service Commission, the new commissioners, but as well as the other agencies, Department of Housing and Community Development, Department of the Environment, and their new dynamic cabinet secretaries, we could have them lead the fight on Empower reform next year and lay the foundation for that during the summer and fall. So it was a frustrating experience, but it was still a worthwhile experience, because I think we did make a lot of progress. And I also want to emphasize that at the very last couple of days there, when we're trying to get the bill through, the governor's legislative office was completely engaged in this. They're completely informed of what was going on. They were active participants, and they're also helping to try and get the bill over the finish line. And so we should also give her and his staff our thanks as well for trying to get it done.
Thank you. I'm going to call on myself to ask a question. So, many things went wrong here, but it sounds like one of them was the complexity of the bill, but another was the opposition, the opposition of the utilities. And we're seeing that, and the utilities in some cases sort of intimidating legislators into feeling like it was too complicated, or they didn't understand, or were worried about the implications. And you talked about Delegate Brian Crosby being emboldened to stand up to utilities. And I'm just curious what you think. We're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing it in Montgomery County and Howard County. Like, the utilities are fighting even very modest measures towards electrification, and getting people really scared that like the grid will fall apart if we make little changes. So I guess I'm just curious others can answer too if we have others on the call who have ideas, but just what you think grassroots folks can do to embolden legislators like Delegate Crosby was to to feel able to shift those power dynamics and stand up to the utilities on behalf of those of us who breathe.
I think it's important for grassroots folks to explain to legislators that this Empower money is not utilities money, it's our money, because it's an assessment on ratepayers and our bills. So these are our funds, not theirs. And that's why our representatives need to have a say in how it's used in the right way. I mean, it's been great when the Empower program started for it to be dedicated towards energy efficiency, but now our state goals after climate solutions are not just energy efficiency, but also reducing the carbon footprint. And so, just because guys buying power does not mean anybody's out to, through this legislation, to prohibit it. It's just that we want to direct our funds that are assessed on our electric bills to go towards where they need to go to. And it's, I mean, I think if we explain it simply like that, it helps give it more attraction.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us. And with that, I am going to go to our final bill, community solar and offshore wind, with Rebecca.
Not our final bill. Don't hang up the Anna Mud.
Oh, sorry.
But that's okay. But yes, Rebecca, go ahead.
2 more bills.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that. I think that was really important to learn. You can always learn something by going through a bill that doesn't pass. And hopefully next year. I will also note that there are other opportunities to weigh in on this program and the Empower program and energy efficiency outside of legislative session. So we should continue the advocacy on the legislation. But when it comes to implementing climate solutions now, there are opportunities to weigh in right now. The Maryland Department of the Environment, I know I'm jumping ahead to next steps, but that's just how my mind works, because I'm like, what can we do about it? And the Climate Solutions Now Act, part of that is to write a plan to get to 60% emissions reductions by 2031. Why 2031? Because one chamber wanted 2030, one chamber wanted 2032. Excellent negotiation, 2031. So we have right now, MDE, Maryland Department of the Environment, is writing their plan. And so that's due it by the end of this year with an interim due in June. So they have an open comment period. You can go on the MDE website and talk about how the elements of this bill that didn't pass should be part of the plan. And you can join Climate Partners on April 26th. We'll put the link in the chat a little bit later to as another avenue for input on that plan. So just wanted to mention that. Keep up the advocacy. Your voice is really important. So I'm going to talk about community solar first. So this bill passed. Thank you to the sponsor, Senator Ben Brooks, and Delegate Lou Clippinger. So the bill did 3 main things. It made the community solar program permanent in the state of Maryland. We were operating under a pilot program that was set to sunset at the end of next year. So it's critical that we pass this bill and make it permanent, because it's working, make it permanent this year so there wasn't market disruption. It was also really important to make this bill, to make community solar work for everyone. So in order to do that, the bill requires consolidated billing, which means that the community solar bill and the utility bill are now on the same sheet of paper. People were getting 2 different bills. So community solar creates the electrons that end up in your house to power it, and then the utilities deliver the electrons to your house in order to power it. So those were 2 separate bills. And so for folks who are on energy assistance, they couldn't use energy assistance on split bills. And so if the whole idea around community solar is to have folks who can't put solar on their own rooftops because they can't afford it, or they don't have the right roof, or they're renting, or there's all kinds of reasons you can't put your own solar on your roof. That is why community solar exists and what it can address. And so for folks on energy assistance, it was really important that we have consolidated billing, one bill. That was part of this bill. And finally, it requires that 40% of the energy produced by community solar projects go to low and moderate income households. This is really a beautiful application of the federal Justice 40 initiative, and making sure that 40% of funding for environmental programs go to communities who have been historically disinvested. So that's where that overburdened, underserved, low to moderate income communities, where that really that comes in, and it's just a really nice application of Justice 40. So that was community solar, and that bill did pass. Any questions on community solar? Feel free to put it in the chat if it comes to you later. All right. And thank the delegates. Just a great time of year to do that. It makes the ask always a little easier when you thank them in the end for the hard work. So the other bill I'm going to talk about is offshore wind. When will consolidated billing take effect? Great question. I'll check the dates on that. Typically bills go into effect June or October of the same year. I don't know if the consolidated billing has an extra lag time to let the utilities sort of build the infrastructure to do that. I will check on that and get back to you. That is a great question. So community, yeah, thanks, Garrett. Crowdsourcing answers, love it. So with offshore wind, so it was the Promoting Offshore Wind Energy Resources Act, or the Power Act. So as far as acronyms go, I think that was a great one. The bill, and it was Delegate Lorik Charkoudian and Senator Katie Fry-Hester. So big shout out to them. And the bill really took a comprehensive look at offshore wind. So not just, let's set a goal, but it's also, how do you bring on offshore wind onshore? How are we creating that wind and then bringing it to your house? It really thinks that how are we paying for it in a more equitable way? And the bill answered all of that. So it set a goal of 8.5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2031. There you have that year again, so not a coincidence. 8.5 gigawatts by 2031. Again, that's going to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's part of the Climate Solutions Now Act. It directs the Public Service Commission to study transmission solutions. So that's how we're bringing that offshore wind onshore, rather than having a project by project transmission line that can be, brought onshore each time, disrupting, sort of onshore and people living nearby. The idea is that you could potentially do something, for example, like you have wind turbines 30 miles offshore. You can connect them at a unified point offshore and then bring them onshore in one big transmission line. So the PSC is going to look at different kinds of solutions like that. That's going to save us a ton of money in the long run and be much less disruptive onshore as we're bringing that energy onshore. It includes labor standards for jobs created, and it builds out existing lease areas for offshore wind. So we do have existing lease areas offshore that US Wind and Ørsted, two companies, are working on building out the wind turbines there. And the idea is that there's about a gigawatt left of wind in those areas. There's capacity so there'll be a new round of procurement to fill out the existing lease areas to make sure we're using those areas to the best, most efficiently. And so in doing that extra build out of that area, we're also going to look at a new way to pay for this clean energy. And that would be through state procurement. So the state has to power all of its government buildings, right? All of the properties owned by the state of Maryland have to be powered anyway. Why not do it with clean energy? So there's going to be a bidding process that happens. And if the pricing works out, this is a totally new and exciting mechanism, not new as a mechanism overall, but new as a way to procure clean energy. So the state is going to look at buying that energy to power its own properties. And if that works out, we can then do it for all of the, building out new lease areas that, will help us meet this 8.5 gigawatt goal. So this bill, as you can tell from a very brief summary, it gets technical really fast. And there were a lot of pieces. So it was a big lift, and a huge shout out to the committees who did a lot of work on this, to the administration. During the session, the governor announced the 8.5 gigawatt goal, which was a huge support for the bill. And so there was just a lot of support needed to get this bill across the finish line. And I hope I'm not giving anything away here, but as we speak, there's an event at Trade Point Atlantic in Baltimore where that bill is going to get signed today. So I hope I didn't jinx it or ruin anything by saying that if it hasn't exactly been signed yet. But that's the news on the street, is that bill is actually getting signed in real time today, right now. So we're still in it, and things are moving forward and really exciting for offshore wind. So I'll check the chat for any questions.
There's one question. Oh, thank you, Sarah. She put the crowdsourcing answers. Great. And yes, stay on if you can, Rebecca, in case more questions pop in, and let's
Absolutely.
hop over to Anna. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Hey, Jody. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. This was really exciting for me to join this call because after 6 years, the statewide forest coalition and so many of you on this call, we were finally able to pass meaningful legislation that significantly improves Maryland's Forest Conservation Act. I'm going to talk a little bit about House Bill 723, Senate Bill 526. Our sponsors were just incredible. Delegate Sarah Love from Montgomery County and Senator Elfreth from Anne Arundel County this year. But before I talk about this legislation, I just want to kind of share a little bit of the background info here. So Maryland's Conservation Act passed in 1991. And it was significantly flawed right out of the gate. It essentially allowed developers to clear cut 4 acres of trees and only have to be required to replant 1 acre. So, and there were several ratios and algorithms and formulas involved in Maryland's Forest Conservation Act, but that's kind of the one we want to stick with when we're talking to the public and to our legislators. Essentially only having a requirement to replant 25% of the trees you cut down. So we knew that this act was significantly flawed. We wanted to make improvements. So starting in 2017, we started working with our General Assembly members and we started working with our grassroots community, many of you who are listening today, to improve the Forest Conservation Act. However, there was just a lot of confusion. We knew that we were losing forests across the state, and we knew that we were losing a significant amount, but the data was kind of patchy. And because of the opposition, mostly from the building industry, it was creating a lot of confusion among the General Assembly. So basically the General Assembly said, okay, we're going to commission a study by the Hughes Center for Agroecology. We're going to really get a handle on how much forest we're losing, why we're losing it, where we're losing it, and then we can come back and pass something that can fix this issue. So while that was happening, we switched strategies and we started passing stronger forest conservation laws on the local level in Anne Arundel County, Howard County, Frederick County. We even just passed a big strengthening law in Montgomery County this past March. So, and we had the Tree Solutions Now Act in 2021, I believe, that mandated 5 million trees be planted in the state of Maryland by 2031. So we stayed busy, but at the end of the day, we really wanted to make sure that we had a consistent statewide law that really strengthened Maryland's Forest Conservation Act so that we were not losing as much forest to development. This brings in House Bill 723 and Senate Bill 526. The Hughes Center for Agroecology, along with the Chesapeake Conservancy, finished this big study. It was a huge undertaking in December, right in time for the General Assembly session. Big surprise, we're losing a ton of forests, right? But this one really pinpointed where exactly that loss was occurring. We found that in Capital Region, Montgomery County and Prince George's County were really leading in forest loss, followed by some counties down in Southern Maryland, Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's. So we had this evidence now. We could go to the General Assembly and we could say, look, this is, here's the proof we need to pass something big and bold to reduce forest loss in Maryland. Our sponsors were fantastic. They brought in, we met personally with, I think, 7 county executives to get them on board, because in the past, MACO, Maryland Association of Counties, had been our biggest opposition. We got them on board. We got MML, Maryland Municipal League, on board. And we even, at the end of the day, we had to make a few amendments that I would say weakened it slightly, but not enough to significantly reduce replanting ratios. And we were able even to get the building industry to, I think, remain neutral, which is as good as it's going to get for legislation like this. So I'll go into a little bit of detail. I think, talking about utilities here, it's really interesting. I'll go into big details about replanting ratios here in a second, but one thing that I think is really interesting about the old Forest Conservation Act, in 1991, it exempted all energy generation footprint from the FCA. So power plants essentially. But we've known from solar and other energy sources that these things have bigger footprints now than they did in 1991. So this new FCA that just passed, the updated FCA, now requires all energy generation footprint is subject to the Forest Conservation Act, including solar facilities. They're subject to reforestation, but not to afforestation. So a little improvement, but an improvement nonetheless, to make sure that we're holding utility companies accountable for the impact they have on our earth. But big news. So again, the replanting ratio is 1 to 4. Every 4 acres, or 4 to 1, every 4 acres you cut down, you're only required to replant 1. That was what happened in 1991. 2023, we see a huge update, 1 to 1 in priority forested areas. So if you plant down a tree or an acre of trees in 2023 in a priority forest area, you are now required to replant that same amount of trees. The 1 to 4 ratio did stick in transit-oriented development areas and multifamily housing areas. And we think that was a really great compromise, because a lot of the opposition we were hearing, well, this legislation is really going to hurt us in terms of helping with affordable housing. And that is not a consequence we wanted to see. We believe to keep this fair and equitable, that we wanted to make sure that development around transit-oriented development and multifamily housing continues. So that was one concession we made, but we felt we all supported it and thought that was a good amendment at the end of the day. There's a lot more going in this legislation. I'm happy to answer questions, but it's 12:57, so I don't want to put you guys too far behind schedule. But just want to real quick thank everybody on this call. I know some of you were with us starting in 2017 on lobby days and rallies outside on Lawyers Mall. So it was just a really great way to wrap up. Our legislation passed at 5 p.m. on the last day of the legislative session on sine die. So we knew we had a really good chance of passing something big this year. This year just felt different with that huge forestry study. And I think that really made a big difference. This was a really big, complicated piece of legislation. And as you guys have heard, that's killed legislation several times. But so it took us 6 years before, the General Assembly really got a good handle on it. But I think we were able to pass something we're really proud of this year, and we couldn't have done it without all of you guys. So thank you so much. And again, I'm really happy to answer any questions, offline or in the chat if there's anything pressing.
So we are willing to extend a little bit, and I know Joelle has some closing comments. There is one question in there. I think if you can address this, or if this is too long of a question, can you speak about the Forest Conservation Act and mitigation banks? And I wonder, and there's 2 hands raised.
Yeah, so in 1991, we said, all right, this is forest mitigation banking. It was kind of just like whatever you want to do, local practices with no restrictions. So the Attorney General actually said no, like you can't do forest mitigation banking anymore, just blanket statement. That really hurt local government's ability to mitigate forest loss. So we work with local governments for permanent allowance for up to 50% of mitigation obligation or 60% with DNR approval. So we are now allowing mitigation banking back into the mix. However, there's some guardrails up to make sure that it's done correctly and responsibly. So that was one way that we were able to bring in our counties and get MACO's support, which was really, really critical to passing this legislation.
Joelle, I'll let you facilitate the rest of this depending on the time.
Sure. Reed has a question, and I think then we'll wrap up this section.
Reed has a question. He's the one with all the answers.
Different Reed.
Different Reed.
Oh, different Reed. Okay, I thought you were talking about Reed Perry from Chesapeake Conservancy, who was really his Chesapeake Conservancy was really helpful in getting the data
this is
clarified.
One of my favorite. Reed, one of my favorite.
The other Reed. Yeah.
So actually, this is partly addressed to Joelle. I wonder if there isn't a silver lining in this Empower story, which is that a new idea with a lot of complicated aspects in a brand new Senate committee got all the way to the finish line almost. And I wonder if with a new governor and a new public service commission, there isn't an opportunity over the course of this year to, in effect, take a blank sheet of paper and see what Empower 2024 would look like and whether we couldn't make it, in fact, considerably better than Empower 23 would have been.
Absolutely. I think you're right on the mark. It's a great opportunity.
First of all, yeah. I want to just, first of all, say the Forest Conservation Act victory is such a big deal. Let's all take a minute and just, I'm going to put some trees in the chat. There we go, to celebrate. That is a big deal. And I want to, yeah, I think the question that Reed's asking, and I'll thanks to Anna. I think the question that Reed's asking is the exact right one. So sort of where do we go from here? What's next? How do we continue this work together? I think maybe there's this, I don't know if there's a slide to illustrate what I'm going to say, but the first thing I just want to emphasize, and it's been said many times, but over the last hour, but please take a minute to say thank you. It matters so much that we not just wave our arms and ask for things from our legislators, but that we also take a minute and notice when they're showing leadership and when they're doing the right thing. That builds partnership. And even in the work we do, which can be very thankless, it is so important to appreciate each other and say thank you for working together. Thank you for fighting to protect our neighbors and our common home. So I invite you to call legislators and thank them for good votes on the legislation. Thank legislators who sponsored these bills, the good bills, whether they passed or not, particularly in the Empower story. Delegate Chi, was our lead sponsor, and she was a champ. I want to make sure we say thank you to her. Len suggested Delegate Crosby as another delegate who deserves a lot of appreciation for standing up to utilities in fighting for Empower. As Rebecca mentioned, on April 26th, the Climate Partners is hosting, which is a kind of a coalition of Maryland folks, groups working on climate issues, is hosting a town hall to solicit input from the public to ensure that future energy legislation is equitable. Molly's going to put that link in there, or Taylor's going to put that link in the chat to register for that town hall. Lastly, remember that our ability to mobilize in these moments and raise our voice is because of the organizing we do all year long in our congregations and in our faith group, in our, the creation care committees of our denominations and whatnot. So doing that organizing, building those teams is the base building that makes it possible to raise our voices so powerfully. So if you want to build your green team, nourish your green team, start a green team in your congregation, this is actually a really critical part of the advocacy that we need to do. IPC offers this fantastic Faithful Green Leaders training where you get your team together and they walk you through building your skill, building your team. That training happens twice a year, and there'll be a link in the chat for signing up to that. I think I'm going to ask that we take down the slides so that I can start the music when I'm finished what I'm going to say. I finally wanted to end with a word of encouragement specifically for those of us who spoke out for strengthening Empower, because I just want to remind all of us that the transformation to an all-electric and clean energy future is inevitable. Like, it is happening, and it is happening whether the utilities like it or not. That transformation is already underway, and the utilities are fighting back so hard because they are scared of us. National IPL board chair Reverend Gerald Durley always says, we are on the winning team. He always says, we are on the winning team, don't forget. And we are on the winning team because we're just telling the obvious truth that burning fossil fuels indoors isn't good for people or our world. And when you think about it, that's pretty obvious. Like, we don't idle our cars inside our houses. We don't, we know it's not a good idea to smoke inside our houses. So we shouldn't be burning fuels inside our houses. Turning away from burning is something that can happen at every level. When you have chances in your home, in your communities, at the county level, next year at the state level, as Reed alluded to, we can speak out. And I just wanted to invite all of us who will be, in the coming year, we can be part of this transformation in small ways. You can just commit right now to only ever calling it methane gas. You don't have to pretend that it's natural. You can just call it methane gas every time. Or when you talk about a certain kind of stove or a certain kind of appliance, you can call it gas burning, a gas burning stove, because you can remind everyone that we're burning things in our houses. It's not natural and words matter. You can invite your congregation to personally engage with the harms of gas burning by testing methane leaks outdoors or nitrogen oxide pollution inside your kitchens. And we're going to have a link in the chat to sign up if you're curious to have someone from one of our coalitions come and help you measure the harms and the pollution caused by gas in your neighborhood or in your kitchen, in your congregational kitchen or in your members' homes. And we'll close out. I want to say thank you. And on behalf of with Interfaith Power and Light, Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, and all of you, thank you. It's such a pleasure and honor to be in this sacred work with all of you. We're going to close as we opened with Serena Partridge's song, reminding us that we'll be here. We will be here, continuing to work together to protect each other and the common home we share.
Thank you, everybody, while she's getting that queued up. Good to see so many of you.
Joelle, we're not hearing anything yet.
He's working on it. And maybe because you're muted? No. Well, I could sing. I don't know all the words, but I know the tune.
We will be here the day after the storm. We will be here. We will be here. We will be here the day after the storm. We will be here. We